All right, so we're going to be looking at Castro's exile into Mexico and return into Cuba, the Granma expedition, and the Santiago uprising. So you might be asking yourself, wait, I thought we were, in this whole trial in Cuba after Castro is freed from prison by Batista's little laws and things, and going a little bit easier on um, his opponents, right? Which includes Castro. That is true, right? But Castro's not going to give up. And because the Cuban government at that time knows that Castro's not going to give up, he knows that he's a target for being rearrested again and assassination by the BRAC agents. So he knows that there's absolutely no way he can beat them there at that moment in time, especially politically through government, because everything's corrupt. And he knows the only way he can help Cuba overcome this is through actual fighting, physical fighting through violence, right? Um, and so Castro goes to Mexico, flees to Mexico with his brother and a few other people, and they form the M26-7 movement, which is like uh, the date that marks when the Moncada barrack attack happened. While in Mexico, they're recruiting people, but in Cuba at the same time, this group is also being formed over there, but secretly, and they're stockpiling and they're preparing for Castro's return with his recruitment, while at the same time, spreading propaganda about Castro and like what his promises are and what the movement promises to bring. And so you have a lot of people joining to the point where Castro doesn't even need to be a part of the Ortodoxo party anymore. And he's gaining popularity and support in Cuba, and it's going to benefit him in the long run, which you'll see. So while in Mexico, he actually manages to get 82 volunteers. Not all of them are Cuban. You have some people from other places, such as Che Guevara, um, who is a communist doctor from Argentina. We will at some point, hopefully next semester, watch a movie that is like centered around Che Guevara. It's an awesome movie. And then there's another, I mean, obviously there were Cubans as well, like Camilo Cienfuegos. Cienfuegos, that's the coolest last name I've ever heard in my life. It literally translates to 100 fires. And so this was a Cuban who joined Castro, and he's right there at the bottom, pictured at the bottom with the big long beard. But anyways, both of these individuals all of these individuals were basically equally interested in getting rid of corporate imperialism in Latin America, not just Cuba, but obviously the focus is Cuba first. Castro was less interested in the communist ideology aspect, especially the one that Che Guevara brought on board. Um, this is really evident in the fact that Castro, in the beginning of his movement, was actually not so much in favor of the communist movement, especially because remember the communists had aligned themselves with Batista. And when Batista called Castro a communist, he's like, nah, look at who you have trying to support you. Now, whether that communist party was truly communist is a different debate to have. But Castro did not want to have the title of a communist in there. And he was also hesitant to call himself a communist because of the USSR. He did not want to alienate his movement. And also, the Communist Party was just not ringing a bell to him. They failed to convince Castro to take a nonviolent approach. That's what they wanted to do. Castro did not want to go in that approach. He knew and felt that he needed to take a more violent approach through a revolution. Um, and so he doesn't listen to them, and he heads back to Cuba. Um, and one of the main reasons outside of that is because the longer they waited to strike against Batista, the higher the risk there was going to be of Batista finding out about all of this and basically destroying the movement. Next slide. So the plan was to take about 82 revolutionaries into Mexico on this old yacht where they managed to like fundraise money through donations to buy it, but the yacht was horrible. Um, the rebels were ill-equipped. The yacht was leaky and was not the best in terms of sailing the rough waters. And it was meant for only 25 passengers, but leave it to a Latino to squeeze in as many people, 82 people, into a freaking yacht. It feels like my childhood uh, in a car. I've never been on a yacht. But, anyways, so because of this, and because of the fact that the yacht couldn't really handle these rough waters, it took them 2 days to get to Cuba not 2 days. It took them 2 days longer. So they were delayed by 2 days. And so on arrival, um, the plan was for them to arrive and the M26-7 Cubans in Cuba would start fighting first, and then that same day, Castro was supposed to arrive on the boat. But because they were delayed by 2 days, these fighters in Cuba are like, what the F? Where's Castro? Where's Castro? You know? And so they had to fight against Batista's army and military by themselves for about 30 hours until they couldn't anymore and they had to flee and hide. This was a setback. But there was a little bit of light shed into this moment in that it proved that there were some people on Castro's side, because a lot of the peasants in the area hid some of those M27 members from being killed, right? They hid them from Batista's army. And so it kind of just shows you that that support is growing. Next slide. So Castro arrives eventually 2 days later on the yacht, the Granma yacht, and they are forced to flee into the swamps because as they are getting down and like, unloading their stuff, um, the Batista's Air Force basically spots them and they're about to die and they know that the army's on their way, so they have to flee and they flee into the swamps. Eventually they get caught again and so they have to flee even further into the Sierra Mountains. And so out of the 82 members that had arrived, only 80 of them basically were able to make it. Most of them were killed off, captured, tortured, and again killed in prison. um, and so the surviving members regrouped in the mountains and formed this guerrilla army. And the plan was to basically do hit and runs against Batista's forces and to gain the support of the peasants in all of this. Um, and although Castro's odds and his guerrilla group's odds were stacked against him, one thing about Castro that you have to understand, which is part of his success, is that he was never like a Debbie Downer. He was always very positive and like trying to like boost morale amongst his men. Is like, yeah, bro, like we just lost a bunch of people. We only got 18 left, but ya va ver Batista, like he's gonna see what we're about. And Batista did see what they were about, which we'll get to eventually. But um, they were able to gain support from the peasants, which is extremely important. If it were not for the peasants, Castro would have lost, right? And so part of the reason they were able to gain the support is because Castro was extremely strict with his soldiers of you need to treat every peasant with kindness and respect. This is something the peasants had never had seen before from any military force, from any police force that was under Batista or anything before that. And so this was new to them, and they kind of liked this. Obviously, right? You want to be respected. In addition to that, Castro and Che Guevara went out of their way to ensure that those who had an education in their little rebel group went out and educated the peasants and teaching them how to read, because about 80% of the peasant population in Cuba did not know how to read. So 80% of the people in that region just they weren't reading and they were being taught. Also, Castro instructed people who were able to give, to assist medically the peasants. They were doing that, right? Che Guevara was a doctor, was because he's dead now, was a doctor, um, a very talented doctor actually, and he was the first trained doctor that a lot of these peasants had ever seen in their entire life. If you remember from the speech that Castro gave in his trial, he talked about the hospitals and all of that stuff, and we'll look at some videos that have to do with that. Castro also had his rebels help the peasants with physically laborious, demanding jobs such as harvesting, and while they were, helping the peasants harvest the food, they listened to their grievances. They gave the rebels which gave the rebels an opportunity to kind of address these things and talk about their movement and convince the peasants to be like, hey, my movement, you should probably join it and support it in whatever way you can. And they did. Additionally, any landlord or any corrupt official, police officer that was caught abusing the peasants were tried and punished. But this was also extended to Castro's rebels. So if any rebel from Castro's group was caught abusing people, they were done, right? They were punished. Not necessarily by death, unless if they were caught killing a peasant or raping a peasant, you can assume it was by death. Okay. So next one, While this method did help gain the support of the peasants, Batista's actions also pushed people towards Castro as well. So the brutality of Batista's army and the police would resort to, you know, abusing the peasants. And anybody who was suspected of helping Castro and his men were abused and sometimes killed and tortured, which was a big demoralized, like really demoralized Batista's army. His people, Batista's army was like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this to these people? These are our people, right? So bit by bit, he starts losing the confidence and the trust of his own army, which has a really negative impact on him. In contrast to this, Castro, again, very strict, avoid brutality at all costs with any civilian especially, but even the captured enemies. Batista soldiers, once they were captured, they were not tortured because that was forbidden, and they were not murdered because that was forbidden. They'd even go as far as treating the wounds. So, like, if there was a shootout and they captured some of the soldiers from Batista, they'd treat them, right? They had Che Guevara and other people who were learning how to treat wounds and stuff, treating them. Um, However, though, again, if any of these men, of Batista's men, were caught being extremely ruthless and were known for doing ruthless things against the peasants, they were tried and then executed. Um, and again, Castro's men too, if one of Castro's men did that as well. So while the peasants saw this and they were like, "That's pretty harsh," but like, I get it, is what the peasants said. They understood that this was the most effective way of gaining justice against corruption and sending a strong message as well of, we mean business, no corruption, no torture, no murder, and if you are caught doing these things, you're going to be punished accordingly. Um, so sorry, I'm like blinking in my head. One other thing that this shows about Castro is that he is extremely adaptable. So remember, he was supposed to arrive on time, but he arrived 2 days late because of the waters. His plan was never to do it this way. His plan was just to go into the city and kind of dig at an uprising, but instead he had to adapt and adjust and go into the mountains and basically formulate a whole new plan. And so it just really shows Castro's leadership as an effective, as a strategist, right? Not stubborn. If he would have stayed stubborn, there's no way they would have won. Next slide. While we have been focusing on peasants, we need to acknowledge that people in the city played a big role in that too, especially the M26 movement had members hiding in the city sabotaging Batista while spreading Castro's propaganda. um, about what was happening in the mountains, about what Castro was doing and how he was helping the peasants and all of that good stuff. The urban movement coordinated with the middle class, the Ortodoxos, and other anti-Batista groups, and they did graffiti and passed out posters while, trying to hide. Um, and there was about 30K acts of sabotage that was committed within the 2 years, which is a big deal, right? Propaganda tends to work sometimes. One of the rebels working in the city, his name was Frank Baiz. He was murdered by Batista's men, the police, right, in 1957, and that kind of sparked a movement and a strike, um, which forced Batista to suspend constitutional rights because of people protesting against that killing. Um, Meanwhile, at the same time, Castro up in the mountains is continuing to strengthen his support. Um, and they are continuing to launch attacks against Batista's government and Batista's men, and they're convincing some of Batista's army to like join their side and all of that good stuff. Um, so one thing that happened in the urban cities was they tried to organize a strike in 1958, and it would take place in March 9th. It was not really successful, though. It was successful in the East Coast of Cuba, but not in the West Coast, because the West Coast, remember in the beginning, East Coast, more oppressed individuals versus the West Coast, more affluent individuals. But this gave Batista the false sense that he was still supported just because the strike did not work. And so he continues to kind of be extremely, um, he continues to basically be very oppressive in his ways. And that just kind of continues to make Batista lose support in every sector of Cuban society.